The fluorescent lights hummed with their usual tired persistence above the DMV waiting area, casting everything in that particular shade of institutional beige that made time feel slower. Plastic chairs arranged in rigid rows faced a digital display board where numbers crawled by at the pace of bureaucratic necessity. The air conditioning wheezed against the October heat seeping through glass doors that had been propped open with a rubber wedge someone had kicked into place hours ago. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Natasha Chun sat in row 3, seat 14, her leather jacket zipped halfway up despite the warmth. The jacket was well worn but cared for, brown leather softened by years of use, with subtle creases that spoke of constant wear rather than occasional fashion. Her jeans were dark wash, practical, and her boots were lace-up work boots that had seen plenty of miles but showed no signs of neglect. Everything about her appearance suggested someone who valued function over form, durability over trends. She held a manila folder in her lap, the kind with a metal clasp that had been opened and closed so many times the corners had softened into curves. Inside were the usual documents: birth certificate, social security card, utility bills with her name and address printed in standard typeface. The address was a small apartment complex on the east side of Bakersfield, California, where the rent was reasonable and the neighbors minded their own business. The woman next to her shifted constantly, checking her phone every 30 seconds and sighing with increasing volume each time. Her purse was designer, her nails were perfect, and she wore the kind of heels that announced their presence with every step. She had been complaining in a stage whisper to her phone for the past 20 minutes about having to take time off work for something as mundane as a license renewal. "This is absolutely ridiculous," the woman muttered, loud enough to ensure everyone within a 10-foot radius could hear her frustration. "I have 3 meetings this afternoon, and they're making me sit here like I don't have anything better to do." Natasha didn't respond. She rarely did in situations like this. Her eyes moved occasionally, tracking the security guard who walked the same pattern every 12 minutes, noting the position of the exit doors, observing the way people moved through the space. But mostly, she waited with the kind of patience that seemed unusual in a world where everyone expected immediate gratification. A baby cried from somewhere, near the front of the room. The sound echoed off the concrete walls and linoleum floors, mixing with the shuffle of feet, the rustle of papers, and the occasional beep from the number system. A teenager in line for his first license bounced on his toes, unable to contain his excitement. His mother stood beside him, equally nervous but trying to project calm authority. The elderly man across the aisle had dozed off in his chair, his head tilted back at an angle that suggested his neck would be sore when he woke up. His paperwork had slipped from his lap and scattered slightly on the floor. Natasha noticed but didn't move to help. In places like this, unsolicited assistance often created more problems than it solved. Behind the bulletproof glass, DMV employees moved with the measured efficiency of people who had processed thousands of identical transactions. They called numbers with practiced indifference, handled documents with mechanical precision, and maintained the kind of professional courtesy that was polite but distant. The woman at window 3 had been there the longest, and her movements had taken on the rhythm of someone counting down the minutes until her shift ended. Natasha's number was B147. The current number being called was B2-131, 16 more people ahead of her, assuming no one had stepped away and would need to be recalled. She had calculated this when she first sat down, not out of impatience, but out of habit. Numbers mattered. Sequences mattered. Knowing where you stood in line could be the difference between making it and missing your chance entirely. The jacket felt heavier than it should have in the warm room, but she kept it zipped. The sleeves extended exactly to her wrists, covering everything they needed to cover. The cuffs were slightly frayed, showing wear patterns that suggested she rolled them up frequently when working, then pulled them back down when she was done. There were faint stains on the leather, nothing obvious, just the kind of marks that accumulated over time. When someone actually used their clothing for work rather than just wearing it, her hands rested on the folder, fingers relaxed but positioned, in a way that suggested she could react quickly if needed. Her nails were short, practical, clean but not manicured. No rings, no jewelry, except for a simple watch with a black face and numbers instead of markers. The watch had a scratch across the crystal that ran from 2 o'clock to 7 o'clock, deep enough to catch the light, but not deep enough to obscure the time. A commotion near the entrance drew everyone's attention. A man in a business suit was arguing with the security guard about something related to the metal detector. His voice carried across the room as he insisted that his belt buckle shouldn't trigger the system, that he came here every year for his commercial license renewal, that this was harassment. The guard remained calm, explaining the procedure with the tired patience of someone who had this conversation multiple times daily. Natasha watched without appearing to watch. Her head didn't turn fully toward the disturbance, but her eyes tracked the interaction. She noted the way the man's face flushed red, the way his hands moved when he spoke, the positioning of the other guard who had moved closer without being obvious about it. She cataloged exit routes, crowd density, potential obstacles if the situation escalated. It didn't escalate. The man eventually removed his belt, walked through the detector without incident, and proceeded to the check-in counter with the sullen compliance of someone who had lost a battle but needed to complete his business anyway. The guards returned to their positions, and the normal rhythm of the DMV resumed. B132, announced the woman at window 5, her voice carrying the particular flatness that came from repeating the same phrase hundreds of times per day. A middle-aged man in paint-stained coveralls stood up, gathered his paperwork, and walked toward the window. He moved with the careful deliberation of someone who wasn't entirely comfortable with bureaucratic processes, but understood their necessity. His documents were organized in a clear plastic folder that had seen better days, and he had rehearsed what he needed to say before approaching the window. Natasha shifted slightly in her chair. The movement was minimal, just enough to relieve pressure from sitting in the same position for 43 minutes. Her posture remained alert but not tense, engaged but not anxious. She had learned long ago that drawing attention to yourself in institutional settings rarely worked in your favor. Better to blend in, follow the process, complete your business efficiently, and leave. The woman with the designer purse had moved on to complaining about the temperature. Too hot, too cold. Can't they regulate the climate properly? What kind of operation are they running here? Her voice had taken on the particular pitch that suggested she was used to having her complaints addressed immediately. When no one responded with appropriate concern, she began typing aggressively on her phone, presumably sharing her ordeal with someone who would validate her frustration. The teenager had finally been called and was now at window 2, practically vibrating with excitement as he handed over his paperwork. His mother stood behind the designated line, watching with the mixture of pride and terror that came with watching your child take another step toward independence. The DMV employee was explaining the vision test, and the boy was nodding enthusiastically. At every instruction, a woman in scrubs entered through the main doors, moving with the purposeful stride of someone on a lunch break who needed to accomplish multiple tasks before returning to work. She checked in at the front desk, received her number, and found a seat in the back row. Her movements were efficient, practiced, suggesting this wasn't her first time navigating the DMV system. She pulled out a medical journal and began reading. Making the most of her waiting time, the elderly man woke up with a start, looked around in confusion for a moment, then began gathering his scattered papers. A woman in the next row leaned over to help, and he accepted her assistance with grateful embarrassment. They spoke in quiet voices about the inefficiency of government offices, the way things used to be faster, the inconvenience of having to renew documents in person when everything else could be done online. B133. Came the call from window 7. A young woman with 2 small children approached the counter, trying to manage her paperwork while keeping her kids from wandering off. One child was fascinated by the rope barriers and kept trying to duck under them, while the other had decided this was the perfect time to practice his singing voice. The DMV employee waited patiently while the mother organized her documents and shushed her children into temporary compliance. Natasha's eyes moved to the clock on the wall. 2:47 p.m. She had arrived at 2:04 p.m., which meant she had been waiting for 43 minutes. Not unreasonable for a DMV visit, but longer than the estimate posted on the website. The digital board showed current wait times of 35 to 40 minutes, which was clearly optimistic given the pace of service she had observed. Her phone remained in her pocket. Unlike most people in the waiting area, she wasn't checking social media, playing games, or sending text messages. She had brought a paperback book, a thriller, about a detective investigating a series of small-town murders, but hadn't opened it. Reading would require dropping her guard in a way that made her uncomfortable in public spaces. Better to stay aware, stay alert, stay ready. The air conditioning cycled on again, pushing slightly cooler air through vents that hadn't been cleaned recently enough. Dust motes danced in the fluorescent light, and the sound of the system masked some of the conversations happening throughout the room. Someone's phone rang with a marimba tone that seemed inappropriately cheerful for the setting. They answered, in hushed tones, trying to explain their delay to whoever was expecting them. A maintenance worker entered through a side door, wheeling a cart loaded with cleaning supplies. He moved systematically through the room, emptying trash cans and wiping down surfaces with the methodical approach of someone who had been doing this job long enough to develop an efficient routine. People moved their feet or shifted their belongings automatically as he worked around them. A choreographed dance of public space navigation. The designer purse woman finally received her number and approached the counter with the air of someone who expected special treatment due to her obvious frustration with the wait. The DMV employee greeted her with the same professional courtesy extended to everyone else, which seemed to surprise and slightly deflate her. Her complaints about wait times and inefficiency fell on deaf ears as the employee began processing her renewal with standard efficiency. Natasha checked the digital board again. B134 was now being called at window 3. Still 12 numbers ahead of her. She calculated another 24 to 30 minutes, assuming the current pace continued. And no complications arose. The teenager had completed his test and was now posing for his license photo, grinning with the kind of joy that came from achieving a long-anticipated milestone. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The woman in scrubs had progressed through half her medical journal, occasionally making notes in the margins with a pen that had been chewed at the cap. Her number wouldn't be called for at least another hour, but she seemed content to use the time for professional development. She had found a way to make the wait productive rather than frustrating, a strategy that suggested either extensive experience with bureaucratic delays or a naturally pragmatic approach to time management. A family group entered through the main doors, parents with 3 children ranging from toddler to teenager. They approached the information desk with a slightly overwhelmed expression of people facing a complex bureaucratic process they didn't fully understand. The clerk began explaining the different requirements for various types of licenses and renewals, and the parents took notes. While trying to keep their younger children from disrupting other people's business, the security guards maintained their positions and patterns, professional but not intimidating, alert but not aggressive. They had found the balance required for managing a space where people were often stressed, sometimes frustrated, and occasionally confrontational. Their presence was reassuring rather than threatening, a visible reminder that help was available if situations became difficult to manage. B135, announced the employee at window 6, and a man in construction gear stood up to claim his place in line. His work clothes were dusty but clean, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone who was comfortable in his own skin, regardless of the setting. He nodded politely to the people around him as he made his way to the front, a small gesture of shared humanity in an impersonal institutional environment. B136 called the woman at window 4, and a college-aged man with nervous energy bounced up from his seat, 3 rows ahead of Natasha. He clutched a folder thick with documents, probably applying for his first license after moving from out of state. His sneakers squeaked against the linoleum as he approached the counter, and he immediately began explaining his situation in rapid, anxious sentences before the clerk had a chance to ask for his paperwork. Natasha observed this interaction, while appearing to study the informational posters mounted on the walls around the waiting area. Her eyes moved systematically across the room, cataloging changes in the environment, new arrivals, people who had left. The maintenance worker had finished his rounds and disappeared through the same side door he had entered. The family with 3 children had received their numbers and found seats near the back, the parents taking turns managing the youngest while the teenager played games on his phone. What most people in the room didn't notice was the way Natasha's breathing remained steady despite the stifling air, how her shoulders stayed level even after sitting in the uncomfortable plastic chair for nearly an hour, or how her feet were positioned flat on the floor rather than crossed or tucked under the seat. These were small details, unconscious habits that spoke to training most civilians never received. The woman with the designer purse had completed her transaction and was now walking toward the exit, her heels clicking with the satisfied rhythm of someone who had finally received the service she felt she deserved. She paused near the door to check her phone, typing rapidly while shaking her head at whatever message she was composing. Behind her, another woman entered wearing yoga pants and an oversized sweatshirt, moving with the unhurried pace of someone whose schedule was more flexible. A commotion erupted near window 2, where the college student was having difficulties with his paperwork. The DMV employee was explaining something about missing documentation, and the young man's voice was rising with frustration. He gestured emphatically with his hands, knocking over a small sign on the counter, which created a sharp plastic crack that echoed through the room. "Sir, I need you to calm down," the employee said, her voice maintaining professional composure despite the tension. "We can resolve this, but I need you to lower your voice and work with me." The young man's face flushed red and he began arguing about deadlines and inconvenience and having driven 2 hours from his college town. Other people in the waiting area turned to watch, some with sympathy, others with annoyance at the disruption. The security guard near the entrance began moving in that direction, not urgently but with clear purpose. Natasha's posture didn't change, but her attention sharpened. Her eyes tracked the guard's movement, assessed the young man's body language, and calculated the distance between her position and potential intervention points. Most people would see an angry college student having a bureaucratic meltdown. She saw escalation patterns, stress indicators, and situational variables that could shift quickly if not managed properly. The crisis resolved itself when the DMV employee called over a supervisor, a middle-aged man with gray hair, and the patient demeanor of someone who had diffused countless similar situations. He spoke quietly with the student, examined the paperwork, and within 3 minutes had identified a solution that satisfied both the regulatory requirements and the young man's urgent timeline. The student's shoulders sagged with relief, and he apologized profusely for raising his voice. B137 came the next call, and a woman in business attire approached window 1. She moved with crisp efficiency, her documentation organized in a leather portfolio that she opened with practiced motions. Her transaction would likely be routine, a straightforward renewal with no complications. The kind of interaction that kept the DMV moving at its standard pace. Natasha shifted her weight slightly, a movement so subtle that no one else would have noticed. The leather jacket remained zipped despite the warmth, and she had made no move to remove it even though several other people had shed outer layers as the afternoon wore on. The sleeves covered her arms completely, ending exactly at her wrists where they met the edge of her work gloves. Wait, she wasn't wearing gloves. A closer look revealed that what appeared to be glove lines were actually tan lines, the kind that came from wearing gloves regularly in outdoor work, but only on the backs of her hands and fingers. Her palms and the inside of her fingers were paler, suggesting gloves that covered the backs but left the palms exposed. Tactical gloves. The kind worn by people who needed hand protection while maintaining finger sensitivity and grip control. Woman in Scrubs had been called and was now at window 5, discussing something complex that required multiple forms and several phone calls to verify information. Her medical journal lay closed on her chair, a bookmark protruding from somewhere around the middle. She had made good use of her waiting time, but now her break was being consumed by bureaucratic complications that were clearly beyond her control. A new arrival caught Natasha's attention, a man in his 50s wearing a Veterans Administration baseball cap and a windbreaker despite the heat. He moved stiffly, favoring his left leg, and carried a manila envelope that had been reinforced with packing tape along the edges. His eyes swept the room once as he entered, a habit shared by people who had learned to assess environments quickly and thoroughly. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, and something passed between them, not recognition exactly, but acknowledgement. The subtle nod of people who had inhabited similar worlds, even if they had never served in the same units or theaters. He found a seat several rows away and began organizing his paperwork with the methodical precision of someone who understood that proper documentation could mean the difference between success and failure in institutional settings. The teenager who had passed his driving test earlier was now at the licensing station, posing for his photo with barely contained excitement. The photographer had to ask him to stop smiling quite so broadly because it was causing shadows that would make the picture unsuitable for official identification. His mother watched from behind the line, alternating between pride and worry as she witnessed another milestone in her child's journey toward independence. B138, announced the clerk at window 7, and an elderly woman with a walker began making her slow way toward the counter. She moved carefully but determinedly, declining offers of assistance from nearby people with polite waves of her free hand. Her purse hung from the walker's handles, and she had attached a small pouch containing her documents to the frame where she could reach it easily. Everything about her setup suggested someone who had adapted to mobility challenges with practical intelligence. Natasha watched this progression with the kind of attention most people reserved for entertainment. But her focus wasn't casual interest, it was professional assessment. She noted the woman's gait pattern, the distribution of weight on the walker, the way she navigated around obstacles. These observations filed themselves away automatically, part of a mental catalog that most people would never think to maintain. The family with 3 children was experiencing their own minor crisis as the toddler had discovered that the rope barriers made excellent jungle gyms. The parents were taking turns intercepting escape attempts while trying to keep their place in line and manage their paperwork. The teenager had been recruited to help, but was clearly more interested in his phone than in sibling supervision. Other waiting passengers watched with the mixture of sympathy and relief that came from observing parenting challenges they didn't currently have to handle themselves. A janitor appeared from a different door than the maintenance worker had used. This one carrying a mop bucket and wearing headphones that leaked enough sound to suggest he was listening to Spanish-language radio. He began cleaning the area near the entrance where the college student's earlier agitation had caused some papers to scatter. His movements were efficient but not rushed, and he worked around the foot traffic without seeming to pay attention to individual people. But Natasha noticed that he was paying attention. His eyes moved constantly, tracking faces and behaviors with the alertness of someone whose job required situational awareness beyond simple maintenance duties. Security, she realized. Not obvious security, not uniform security, but security. Nonetheless, the DMV had layers of protection that most visitors never recognized. The woman in business attire completed her transaction efficiently and headed for the exit, pausing only to dispose of some unnecessary paperwork in the trash can. Near the door, her movements suggested someone accustomed to navigating bureaucratic systems successfully, prepared, patient, professional. The kind of person who made appointments in advance, brought exact documentation, and never raised her voice at civil servants who were simply doing their jobs. B139, came the call from window 3, and a construction worker in dusty clothes approached the counter. His work boots left faint dirt prints on the floor, and his hard hat hung from a clip on his tool belt. He moved with the confident stride of someone comfortable in his own skin, regardless of the setting, unfazed by the institutional atmosphere that seemed to intimidate some visitors. Natasha's number was B-147, 8 more people ahead of her now, which meant approximately 16 to 20 minutes if the current pace continued. She had been sitting for over an hour, but showed no signs of the restlessness that was affecting most other long-term waiters. No fidgeting, no sighing, no checking her phone for distraction. Just patient observation and environmental awareness that seemed almost supernatural in its consistency. The veteran with the reinforced envelope had been called and was now at window 6, presenting his documentation with military precision. His papers were organized in clear plastic sleeves, arranged in the exact order requested by the DMV requirements, with backup copies attached behind originals. The clerk's expression suggested appreciation for this level of preparation, and the transaction was proceeding smoothly as a result. A woman entered wearing nurse scrubs and pediatric prints, cartoon animals dancing across bright blue fabric. She looked exhausted in the way that suggested a double shift rather than simple afternoon fatigue, and she checked in with the mechanical movements of someone running on professional autopilot. Her number put her at least 90 minutes away from service, but she found a seat and immediately closed her eyes, apparently planning to use the wait time for rest rather than entertainment, the college student who had experienced the earlier paperwork crisis was now at the photo station, his documentation issues resolved and his demeanor transformed back to nervous excitement. He kept adjusting his shirt and running his hands through his hair, trying to look presentable for what would likely be his primary form of identification for the next several years. The photographer waited patiently through multiple hair adjustments before finally capturing an acceptable image. B140, called the employee at window 2, and a middle-aged man in a postal service uniform approached the counter. He carried himself with the steady competence of someone accustomed to dealing with regulations and documentation requirements as part of his daily work. His transaction would likely be routine. Government employees tended to understand government processes better than average civilians. The elderly woman with the walker had completed her business and was making her careful way back through the waiting area toward the exit. Several people offered assistance, which she declined with gracious thanks, but a young man near the door held it open for her without being asked. She paused to thank him, and they exchanged a few words about the weather and the efficiency of the DMV staff. Small human connections that made bureaucratic experiences more bearable. Natasha observed these interactions while maintaining her position and posture. Her leather jacket remained zipped, her documentation stayed organized in its manila folder, and her boots remained planted firmly on the floor. To casual observers, She appeared to be simply another patient customer waiting her turn. But the quality of her attention, the consistency of her environmental awareness, and the unconscious habits of her positioning suggested someone with training that went far beyond civilian requirements. The family with 3 children finally received their number call, and the parents began the complex logistics of moving their group to the service counter, while maintaining control of their youngest child's exploratory impulses. The teenager, helped by carrying paperwork and keeping pace with his parents, finally engaged in family business rather than his phone. The toddler seemed to view the entire experience as an elaborate game designed for his entertainment. 7 more numbers until B147. Natasha's time was approaching, but her demeanor showed no change in anticipation or anxiety. Whatever brought her to the DMV today, she would handle it with the same methodical competence she brought to everything else. In a room full of people displaying various levels of stress, impatience, and bureaucratic frustration, she remained a calm center of professional composure that somehow never quite drew attention to itself. The heat in Kandahar province struck like a physical weight, pressing down through the thin mountain air with an intensity that made every breath feel labored. Staff Sergeant Natasha Chen adjusted her grip on the M4 carbine, feeling the familiar burn of metal that had been baking in the Afghan sun for hours. The forward operating base stretched out behind her, a collection of prefab structures and defensive positions carved into the rocky landscape like a scar across the ancient terrain. It was September 2019, and her 3rd deployment to the region. By now, she knew the rhythm of the place, the way sound carried differently in the thin air, how shadows fell short and sharp in the high-altitude light, the particular quality of silence that meant either safety or imminent danger. Her squad was completing a routine patrol sweep of the valley approaches, checking for IED placements and insurgent movement along the supply routes that kept their base operational. Lieutenant Rebecca Morrison walked point, her radio crackling with intermittent check-ins from command. Behind her, Corporal James Bradley carried the squad's heavy equipment, his pack loaded with additional ammunition and medical supplies. Private First Class Maria Santos brought up the rear, her sniper rifle slung across her back, eyes constantly scanning the ridgelines for movement. They had worked together for 8 months, long enough to develop the wordless communication that kept small units alive in hostile territory. The village they were approaching had been marked as friendly territory on their maps, a collection of mud brick compounds where tribal elders had signed cooperation agreements with coalition forces. Intelligence reports suggested the local population was tired of Taliban interference and willing to provide information about insurgent activities in exchange for security and infrastructure improvements. It should have been a routine stop. Verify the location, check in with village leadership, document any changes in population or defensive positions. Natasha had been in enough routine stops to know that routine was a luxury, not a guarantee. Her eyes moved constantly as they approached the settlement, cataloging escape routes, defensive positions, and potential ambush sites. The village sat in a natural depression surrounded by low hills that offered excellent cover for hostile forces. Too many angles, too many unknowns, too many places where threats could develop faster than a small patrol could respond. The first sign of trouble was the absence of children. Villages in this region typically announced approaching patrols, with the sound of kids running between compounds, calling out to friends and family about the soldiers coming up the valley. Today, the settlement was quiet in a way that made the hair on Natasha's neck stand up. No voices, no movement, no signs of normal daily activity. Lieutenant Morrison raised her fist, signaling the patrol to halt. She keyed her radio, requesting permission to approach the village perimeter for closer reconnaissance. Command responded with standard authorization: proceed with caution, maintain communication protocols, extract immediately if hostile contact was initiated. The kind of orders that sounded clear from a distance, but became complicated when you were the one making split-second decisions in unknown terrain. They advanced in tactical formation, spacing themselves to minimize casualties if they encountered explosive devices or ambush fire. Natasha took the left flank, using a drainage ditch for concealment as she moved parallel to the main path. The silence was oppressive now, broken only by the crunch of their boots on loose gravel and the distant sound of wind moving through the valley. The first compound they reached showed signs of recent habitation, cook fires that were still warm, tools left in mid-use, clothes hanging on lines that suggested people had left quickly, but not in panic. Natasha noted these details while maintaining her sector of observation, filing away information that might become crucial if the situation developed into something more dangerous than a routine patrol. Lieutenant Morrison signaled for Bradley and Santos to establish overwatch positions while she and Natasha moved forward to investigate the central compound where village leadership typically conducted business. The building was larger than the surrounding structures, with thick walls and narrow windows that would provide excellent defensive positions for anyone inside. Approaching it required crossing open ground where they would be exposed to fire from multiple directions. They moved quickly but carefully, using cover where available and maintaining communication through hand signals. The compound's main door stood open, unusual for midday when the heat typically drove people indoors. Natasha positioned herself to cover the entrance while Morrison approached the threshold, her rifle at ready position but not overtly threatening. Standard protocol for potentially friendly contact in uncertain circumstances. The interior of the compound was empty, but showed signs of a meeting that had been interrupted recently. Tea glasses sat half full on a low table, documents were scattered across the floor, and chairs were overturned in a pattern that suggested people had left hurriedly. Morrison photographed the scene with a tactical camera while Natasha maintained security, watching for movement in the surrounding buildings. That was when they heard the sound, a low whimper that seemed to come from beneath the floor. Both soldiers froze, weapons trained on the source of the noise. Morrison signaled for quiet and pointed toward a corner of the room where several floorboards appeared to have been recently disturbed. The sound came again, clearly human, clearly distressed. Natasha moved to the indicated position while Morrison covered her approach. Beneath the loose boards, they discovered a hidden chamber that had been carved out of the earth beneath the compound's foundation. It was a hiding place, designed to conceal people or supplies from hostile forces. What they found inside changed everything. 3 children, none older than 10, huddled together in the cramped space. They were dehydrated, terrified, and showed signs of having been hidden there for at least 24 hours. The oldest, a girl with enormous dark eyes, clutched a piece of paper with writing in both Pashto and broken English. When Morrison carefully extracted the children from their hiding place, the girl pressed the paper into her hands with desperate urgency. The message, when they managed to translate it using Morrison's field guide, was a warning. Taliban forces had infiltrated the village 3 days earlier, forcing the population to evacuate under threat of execution. The children had been hidden by their grandmother, who had been captured while trying to retrieve supplies. The village was now being used as a staging area for an attack on the coalition base, scheduled for dawn the following day. Morrison immediately keyed her radio to report the intelligence, but the transmission was jammed. Electronic interference filled the frequencies, making communication with base impossible. They were operating in a communications blackout, with actionable intelligence about an imminent attack and no way to warn their command structure. Tactical situation had shifted from routine patrol to potential disaster. The children needed medical attention and evacuation, but moving them would compromise any attempt at stealth withdrawal. Staying to care for them would put the patrol at risk if Taliban forces returned to the village. Either choice carried significant risks, but Morrison made the decision that would define the rest of their lives. They would extract the children and fight their way out if necessary. Bradley and Santos were recalled from their overwatch positions and briefed on the situation. The plan was simple in concept, but dangerous in execution. Move the children to a defensive position outside the village. Attempt to re-establish communication with the base and call for immediate extraction. If communication remained compromised, they would carry the children to a predetermined rally point where they could link up with friendly forces. The movement began smoothly. The children, despite their fear and exhaustion, seemed to understand the urgency of the situation and followed instructions without hesitation. Natasha carried the youngest, a boy who couldn't have been more than 6 years old, while Morrison and Santos helped the other two navigate the rough terrain. Bradley provided rear security, watching for pursuit from the village they were leaving behind. They had covered perhaps half a mile when the first explosion echoed across the valley, then another. Then the distinctive crack of rifle fire from multiple positions. The village they had just evacuated was under attack, which meant Taliban forces had returned and discovered the absence of both the children and the patrol. The hunt was beginning. Morrison found a defensible position among a cluster of boulders and established a temporary perimeter. The children were placed in the center of the formation, protected by overlapping fields of fire from the 4 soldiers. Radio communication remained jammed, but they could hear helicopter rotors in the distance search and rescue assets, responding to their missed check-in with base command. The Taliban fighters appeared on the ridgeline above them, moving with the tactical confidence of people who knew the terrain and believed they had numerical superiority. Natasha counted at least 12 fighters, armed with automatic weapons and rocket-propelled grenades. Her squad was outnumbered 3-1 in unfamiliar terrain. With civilian casualties to protect, the firefight began when Santos engaged the lead Taliban fighter with her sniper rifle. Her shot was clean and immediate, dropping the target and creating confusion among the remaining attackers. But it also revealed their position and drew concentrated fire from multiple directions. Rounds impacted the rocks around them, sending stone fragments flying like secondary projectiles. Bradley's machine gun provided, suppressing fire while Morrison coordinated their defense through hand signals. The children pressed themselves against the rocks, following instructions to stay low and quiet despite the chaos erupting around them. The youngest boy had wrapped his arms around Natasha's leg, and she could feel him shaking with each explosion that echoed across the rocks. The battle lasted 17 minutes. 17 minutes of controlled aggression, tactical movement, and split-second decisions that determined who lived and who died in a remote valley that most Americans would never see on a map. When the shooting stopped, 3 Taliban fighters were confirmed dead, and the rest had withdrawn to positions too distant for accurate fire. But the squad had paid a price. Bradley had taken shrapnel in his left shoulder from an RPG that had detonated close enough to shower them with rock fragments. Santos had a graze across her forehead that was bleeding heavily but didn't appear serious. Morrison's radio had been destroyed by rifle fire, eliminating any hope of communication with the base until the jamming stopped. The helicopters found them 43 minutes later, guided by the GPS beacon Morrison had activated when the firefight began. The extraction was swift and professional. Children loaded first, wounded second, then the rest of the squad with their equipment. As the aircraft lifted off, Natasha looked down at the village where the day had started as a routine patrol and ended as a combat rescue mission. The after-action report praised the squad's initiative in gathering intelligence and protecting civilian casualties under hostile fire. The children were reunited with surviving family members who had evacuated to a refugee camp near the Pakistani border. The Taliban attack on the base never materialized, disrupted by the loss of their staging area and the exposure of their operational timeline. But for Natasha, the mission had revealed something that would change her relationship with military service forever. In the moment when she had to choose between tactical doctrine and human compassion, she had discovered that her moral compass pointed in a direction that didn't always align with military objectives. The children had been saved because Morrison had made a decision based on conscience rather than protocol. 6 months later, when faced with a similar choice in a different valley with different civilians at risk, Natasha would make her own decision. And it would cost her everything she had worked to build in 10 years of military service. The apartment complex on Riverside Drive had seen better decades. Built in the 1970s with optimistic visions of affordable housing, it now served as a way station for people rebuilding their lives after various forms of setbacks. The stucco exterior had faded to a color that wasn't quite beige and wasn't quite gray, and the landscaping consisted mainly of drought-resistant plants that required minimal maintenance from an overworked management company. Natasha's unit was on the second floor, corner position, with windows facing both the parking lot and a small courtyard where children played during the cooler hours of morning and evening. She had chosen the location deliberately, multiple exit routes, clear sight lines, minimal shared walls with neighbors. The rent was $847 per month, utilities included, which fit comfortably within her budget from the job at Morrison Industrial Supply. The job itself was exactly what she needed, steady work that utilized her organizational skills without requiring her to explain gaps in her employment history or submit to extensive background checks. She managed inventory for a company that supplied hardware and tools to construction contractors throughout the Central Valley. The work was methodical, precise, and allowed her to maintain the kind of routine that kept her grounded in civilian life. Her supervisor, Gary Henderson, was a former Navy mechanic who had transitioned to civilian work 20 years earlier. He asked no questions about her military experience beyond confirming that she could handle the physical demands of warehouse work and the mental requirements of inventory management. Their professional relationship was built on competence and reliability rather than personal connection, which suited them both perfectly. The warehouse occupied a converted aircraft hangar on the outskirts of Bakersfield, near the airport, but far enough from residential areas to allow for the noise and traffic generated by delivery trucks and industrial equipment. Natasha arrived each morning at 6:30 a.m., 30 minutes before her official start time, and used the extra time to review the day's shipping manifests and check for any overnight changes to priority orders. Her workspace was a corner office that had been carved out of the main warehouse floor, with glass windows that allowed her to monitor both the loading docks and the main inventory aisles. She had arranged her desk to face the entrance while maintaining clear views of all access points. To casual observers, it looked like an efficient workspace organization. To anyone with tactical training, it was defensive positioning that had become second nature. The morning routine began with coffee from a thermos she brought from home and a systematic review of the computer systems that tracked incoming and outgoing inventory. She cross-referenced digital records with physical counts, identified discrepancies that needed investigation, and prepared shipping documents for the day's deliveries. The work required attention to detail and organizational discipline, skills that translated directly from military logistics experience. Her co-workers were a mix of long-term employees who had settled into comfortable routines and newer hires who were either working their way up or working their way through temporary financial difficulties. She maintained cordial but professional relationships with all of them, participating in break-room conversations about weather and weekend plans, while avoiding topics that might lead to personal questions about her background. The lunch break was 30 minutes, which she typically spent in her car in the parking lot, reading paperback novels from the local library or planning errands that needed to be completed after work. She rarely joined group lunches or social activities, not out of unfriendliness, but because solitude had become her preferred method of recharging between periods of required social interaction. After work, she maintained a routine that would have been familiar to anyone who had served in combat units. Physical training at a 24-hour gym that catered to shift workers and people who preferred to exercise when facilities were less crowded. She focused on functional fitness, strength, endurance, flexibility, and coordination exercises that maintained the kind of physical readiness that had once been professionally required and was now personally necessary. The gym was located in a strip mall that had adapted to serve the needs of working-class residents who couldn't afford boutique fitness centers or didn't feel comfortable in more upscale facilities. The equipment was older but well-maintained, and the atmosphere was focused on results rather than social networking. Natasha could complete her workout routine without conversation. Beyond polite greetings and equipment-sharing coordination, her training regimen included elements that most gym members wouldn't recognize: tactical movement drills adapted for civilian spaces, stress inoculation exercises that prepared her mind for unexpected situations, and weapons handling practice using weighted implements that simulated the balance and heft of military equipment. To observers, she appeared to be someone who took fitness seriously. The reality was more complex. Evenings were spent in her apartment, which she had furnished with items from thrift stores and online retailers that prioritized function over appearance. The furniture was sturdy and easily replaceable, arranged to maximize space utilization and maintain clear movement patterns throughout the small rooms. She had no television but owned a tablet for reading news and streaming movies when she needed background noise. The kitchen was equipped with basic appliances and stocked with non-perishable foods that could be prepared quickly and stored efficiently. She cooked simple meals that provided adequate nutrition without requiring extensive preparation time or generating too much cleanup. Eating was fuel, not entertainment, though she occasionally indulged in takeout from a Vietnamese restaurant that reminded her of flavors from her childhood. Her bedroom contained a twin bed with military standard sheets and blankets, a small dresser that held clothing appropriate for work and casual activities, and a closet that was organized with the precision of someone who had learned to pack and unpack personal belongings quickly and efficiently. Everything she owned could be loaded into her car and transported within 2 hours if circumstances required relocation. The bathroom medicine cabinet contained basic toiletries, over-the-counter medications for common ailments, and a first aid kit that was more comprehensive than most civilians would consider necessary. She maintained supplies for treating cuts, burns, sprains, and other injuries that could occur during normal daily activities or emergency situations. Preparation had become a habit rather than paranoia. In the living room, a small bookshelf held paperback novels, technical manuals from her warehouse job, and a collection of books about history and current events that helped her stay informed about world developments. She read voraciously, partly for entertainment but mainly to maintain the kind of broad knowledge base that had been valuable during military briefings and remained useful for understanding complex situations. The apartment's most distinctive feature was what it lacked: personal photographs, decorative items that revealed information about her background, mementos that connected her current life to her previous experiences. She had learned to travel light, both physically and emotionally, carrying only what was essential for immediate needs and long-term survival. Her car was a 2014 Honda Accord that she had purchased with cash from a used car dealer who asked no questions about financing or credit history. The vehicle was reliable, fuel-efficient, and common enough to blend into any parking lot or traffic situation. She maintained it meticulously, performing oil changes and basic maintenance according to manufacturer specifications rather than dealer recommendations. The car's interior was kept clean and organized, with emergency supplies stored in the trunk. Water, non-perishable food, basic tools, first aid equipment, and seasonal clothing. To most people, it would appear that she was simply well prepared for road trips or outdoor activities. The reality was that she maintained the capability to become mobile and self-sufficient within minutes of receiving notification that relocation was necessary. Weekends followed a pattern that balanced maintenance activities with limited social interaction. Saturday mornings were reserved for grocery shopping, laundry, and apartment cleaning. She shopped at a large chain store where employees didn't remember individual customers, and checkout was automated enough to minimize conversation. The laundromat was located 2 blocks from her apartment and operated with industrial-grade machines that could handle work clothes and heavy fabrics efficiently. Saturday afternoons were often spent at the public library, where she could access internet services without creating digital trails associated with her home address, check out books without cost, and sit in quiet spaces that encouraged reading and research. The library served diverse populations and maintained the kind of anonymity that suited her preference for minimal social engagement. Sunday mornings included a longer workout routine at the gym, followed by meal preparation for the upcoming work week. She cooked larger quantities of basic foods that could be portioned and stored for quick reheating during busy weekdays. The process was efficient and economical, reducing both food costs and time spent on daily meal preparation. Sunday afternoons were her only completely unstructured time, which she used for reading, minor apartment maintenance, or driving to nearby natural areas where she could walk on hiking trails without encountering crowds. These excursions served multiple purposes: physical exercise, mental relaxation, and maintenance of navigation skills in unfamiliar terrain. The hiking provided opportunities to practice movement techniques that couldn't be safely rehearsed in urban environments. She used the time to maintain proficiency with land navigation, camouflage and concealment, and observation skills that had once been professionally essential. To other hikers, she appeared to be someone who enjoyed outdoor recreation and took safety precautions seriously. Her financial situation was stable but modest. She lived within her means, saved a percentage of each paycheck, and maintained emergency funds that could support her for several months without employment. Her expenses were minimal: rent, utilities, food, transportation, gym membership, and basic clothing as needed. She avoided debt, credit cards, and financial arrangements that would create long-term obligations or generate detailed records of her spending patterns. Banking was conducted at a large national institution where she maintained checking and savings accounts under her legal name. Transactions were routine: direct deposit from her employer, automatic payments for fixed expenses, and occasional cash withdrawals for purchases that she preferred not to document electronically. Her financial footprint was that of a working-class person living responsibly within modest means. The evening before her DMV appointment, she had followed her usual routine with one small addition. After completing her workout and returning to her apartment, she had retrieved a manila folder from a locked file cabinet and reviewed the documents she would need for her license renewal. Everything was in order: birth certificate, social security card, proof of residence, current license. But as she handled the paperwork, she noticed something that made her pause. The proof of residence was a utility bill that showed her address as 2847 Riverside Drive, Unit 12. The license she was renewing showed her previous address as 1429 Cedar Street, Apartment 3B. Between those two addresses was a gap of 4 years, and a story that would never appear in any official record. She had moved to Bakersfield 18 months earlier, after spending time in 3 other cities where she had worked similar jobs and maintained similar routines. The pattern was deliberate: establish residency, find employment, maintain a low profile, relocate when circumstances suggested it was advisable. Not running from anything specific, just maintaining the kind of mobility that kept her options open and her exposure minimal. The DMV appointment was routine business that every citizen was required to handle periodically. But for Natasha, it represented something more complex. and interaction with government systems that maintained records, cross-reference databases, and potentially triggered attention from agencies that might have reasons to locate former military personnel who had left service under ambiguous circumstances. She had prepared for the appointment, the way she prepared for everything else, thoroughly, professionally, with contingency plans for complications that probably wouldn't arise, but could derail the entire process if they did. The leather jacket would stay zipped, the paperwork would be organized and correct, and the transaction would be completed efficiently and without drawing attention to herself or her background. Tomorrow morning, she would drive to the DMV, wait her turn, present her documents, and receive a renewed license that would be valid for another 5 years. It should be simple, routine, and unremarkable. But her experience had taught her that simple situations could become complicated very quickly, and that preparation was the difference between successful mission completion and catastrophic failure. B-141, announced the clerk at window 1. And the postal worker stepped forward with his familiar efficiency. Natasha counted 6 more numbers until her turn, which meant roughly 12 minutes if the current pace held steady. She shifted slightly in her seat, not from impatience, but to relieve pressure on her left knee, which had been bothering her since the previous weekend's hike in the Tehachapi Mountains. The movement caused her jacket to pull slightly across her shoulders, and she felt the familiar restriction of fabric that had shrunk minimally over the years. The leather was still supple and well-maintained, but it had adapted to her body in ways that sometimes made quick movement challenging. She made a mental note to consider replacing it, though finding another jacket with the same combination of durability and unremarkable appearance would require careful shopping. A new arrival drew her attention, a woman in her early 30s, wearing business casual attire and carrying a leather portfolio that suggested professional responsibilities. But what caught Natasha's interest wasn't the woman's appearance, it was her behavior. She approached the information desk with confident strides, spoke to the clerk in tones too low to overhear, and received directions that she acknowledged. With sharp nods rather than casual thanks, the woman's eyes swept the waiting area systematically, pausing briefly on each occupied seat before moving to the next. Not the casual glance of someone looking for an empty chair, but the methodical assessment of someone cataloging faces and positions. When her gaze reached Natasha, it lingered for a fraction of a second longer than the others before continuing its circuit of the room. Professional interest. Natasha realized the woman wasn't here for routine DMV business. She was here for someone specific, and her search pattern suggested she was looking for a person she could identify but hadn't yet located. Government worker, most likely. Federal rather than state, based on the quality of her clothing and the confidence of her movements in an institutional setting. The woman received her number from the automated dispenser and found a seat 3 rows behind Natasha, positioning herself where she could observe most of the waiting area while maintaining the appearance of casual patience. She opened her portfolio and began reviewing documents, but her peripheral vision remained active, monitoring movement and changes in the room's population. B-142, came the call from window 4, and a woman with 2 young children began the complex process of approaching the service counter while managing kids who viewed the DMV as an elaborate playground. The mother's stress was visible in the way she juggled paperwork, purse, and parental supervision, speaking in the kind of urgent whispers parents used when trying to maintain control in public spaces. Natasha's attention split between the bureaucratic theater happening at the service windows and the surveillance being conducted by the woman with the portfolio. Federal agents typically worked in pairs, which meant there was likely another person in the building who hadn't been identified yet. She began a more systematic observation of the room, looking for individuals whose behavior patterns suggested coordination with the woman in business attire. The veteran with the reinforced envelope had completed his transaction and was walking toward the exit, moving with the measured pace of someone whose business had been concluded satisfactorily. As he passed the woman with the portfolio, she glanced up from her documents briefly. Not recognition, but acknowledgement. A subtle signal that confirmed Natasha's assessment. Multiple agents, coordinated surveillance, specific target, a maintenance worker emerged from the same side door the janitor had used earlier. But this one carried different equipment. Electronic devices that looked like they belonged in a telecommunications repair kit rather than a custodial supply closet. He began working on a wall-mounted display near the main entrance, but his positioning allowed him to observe everyone entering or leaving the building. Technical surveillance, designed to supplement human observation with electronic monitoring. The college student who had experienced earlier paperwork difficulties was now at the photo station, posing for his license picture with the nervous excitement of someone achieving a significant milestone. But as the photographer adjusted his equipment, Natasha noticed that the camera angle seemed wrong, tilted slightly to capture more of the waiting area than necessary for individual identification photos. Another piece of the surveillance apparatus. B-143, announced the clerk at window 7, and a middle-aged man in work clothes approached the counter. His transaction would likely be routine, but Natasha used his movement as cover to turn slightly in her seat, providing a better view of the room's rear section where additional surveillance personnel might be positioned. 2 men near the back wall had been sitting in the same seats for over an hour without being called for service. They held numbers that should have been processed long ago, but neither had approached the information desk to inquire about delays. Instead, they maintained quiet conversation while periodically scanning the room, their attention focused on people rather than the service windows, where their own business should be conducted. The surveillance team was larger than she had initially assessed. At least 4 agents inside the building, plus the technical specialist working on electronic monitoring equipment. This wasn't casual observation or routine security. It was a significant operation targeting someone they expected to appear at this specific location during this specific time window. The question was whether she was the target or simply someone who had the misfortune to be present during an operation aimed at someone else. Her documents were legitimate, her appearance was unremarkable, and her behavior had been consistently normal throughout her time in the waiting area. But federal agencies had resources that could connect seemingly unrelated information in ways that revealed patterns invisible to the people being monitored. Commotion near the entrance provided momentary distraction as someone triggered the metal detector while arguing with security about the sensitivity of the equipment. The disruption lasted less than 30 seconds, but it served as cover for the woman with the portfolio to change positions, moving to a seat that provided better visibility of the service windows and the areas where people waited after completing their transactions. B-144 called the employee at window 2, and the woman with young children approached the counter, still managing the complex logistics of documentation and child supervision. Her kids had finally settled into the kind of exhausted compliance that came after extended periods of public behavior requirements, and the transaction proceeded more smoothly than their earlier struggles had suggested. 3 more numbers until B-147. Natasha calculated approximately 6 minutes until her turn, assuming no complications arose with the current or intervening customers. But the presence of federal surveillance had introduced variables that could disrupt normal timing. If she was the target, they might attempt contact during her transaction. If someone else was the target, she might become involved inadvertently if situations developed in unpredictable directions. The maintenance worker finished his equipment installation and began packing his tools, but he didn't leave through the side door he had entered. Instead, he walked toward the main entrance, positioning himself near the security checkpoint where he could monitor everyone entering or leaving the building. The electronic equipment he had installed was now active, indicated by small LED lights that pulsed in patterns suggesting data. Transmission. Another federal agent entered through the main doors, this one wearing casual clothing that was slightly too neat for someone conducting routine DMV business. Khaki pants with sharp creases, polo shirt that looked recently purchased, athletic shoes that were clean enough to suggest office work rather than manual labor. He checked in at the information desk and received his number, but his eyes were already scanning the waiting area before the clerk finished, explaining the process. The surveillance net was expanding rather than contracting, which suggested that either their target hadn't been located yet, or that the operation was entering a more active phase. Natasha remained in her seat, maintaining normal behavior patterns while mentally rehearsing responses to various scenarios that might unfold. If approached for identification, she would comply with reasonable requests while asserting appropriate rights. If detained, she would request legal representation and refuse to answer questions without attorney presence. B145, announced the clerk at window 6. And a teenager approached the counter with the nervous energy of someone taking their first driving test. His mother waited in the designated area behind the service line, clearly more anxious about the outcome than her son, who seemed confident in his preparation and abilities. The woman with the portfolio closed her documents and stood up, walking toward the restroom area but taking a route that allowed her to pass close to several occupied seats. As she moved, she made brief eye contact with the two men near the back wall, a signal that suggested coordination between team members. The operation was shifting into a more active phase. 2 more numbers until B147. Natasha's transaction was approaching, but the federal presence had created complications that required careful consideration. She could leave now, claiming a forgotten document or sudden illness, but that behavior might trigger immediate attention if she was indeed there. Target. She could proceed with her business normally, accepting whatever contact might occur, but that approach surrendered initiative to people whose intentions remained unclear. A third option was to complete her transaction efficiently while maintaining awareness of surveillance activities, then leave the building through normal procedures while observing for any attempt at contact or follow-up monitoring. This approach balanced compliance with self-protection, avoiding behavior that would escalate tensions while preserving her ability to respond to developing situations. The teenager passed his vision test and was now posing for his license photo, grinning with the satisfaction of someone who had achieved a significant personal milestone. His mother relaxed visibly as it became clear that the process was concluding successfully, and they began discussing celebration plans for his newfound driving independence. B146, called the employee at window 3, and an elderly man with a walker began making his careful way toward the service counter. His movement was slow but determined, and other people in the waiting area automatically shifted their positions to provide clear passage for his approach to the counter. 1 more number until her turn. Natasha checked her manila folder one final time, ensuring that all required documents were organized in the proper sequence for efficient presentation. Her driver's license, birth certificate, social security card, and utility bill were arranged in the order typically requested by DMV personnel, reducing the time required for transaction completion. The federal surveillance team had positioned themselves to monitor her approach to the service window, her interaction with DMV personnel, and her exit from the building. They were prepared for multiple contingencies, suggesting that whatever information they possessed about her background was sufficient to justify significant resource allocation for this operation. But they had made one crucial miscalculation. They assumed she hadn't noticed their presence, that civilian life had dulled her observational skills and tactical awareness. They were operating under the premise that former military personnel automatically became easier targets once they transitioned to civilian status, that institutional training degraded without institutional reinforcement, The reality was more complex. Combat veterans didn't lose their skills when they left service. They adapted those skills to civilian environments, while maintaining the core competencies that had kept them alive in hostile situations. Surveillance techniques that worked against untrained targets became obvious to people who had been taught to recognize and counter such operations. Natasha remained seated, documents ready, posture relaxed, breathing steady. Whatever happened when her number was called, she would be prepared to respond appropriately. The federal agents could observe, but they couldn't control the outcome of an encounter with someone who understood their methods and had no intention of making their job easier than necessary. The elderly man was having difficulties with his paperwork, requiring assistance from the DMV employee to locate specific documents in his collection of folders and envelopes. The delay would extend the time until her number was called, providing additional minutes to assess the surveillance team's positioning and prepare for the interaction that was about to determine whether her carefully constructed civilian life would continue or become another casualty of her military past. B-147, announced the clerk at window 5, her voice carrying the same professional neutrality that had characterized every previous number call throughout the afternoon. Natasha stood smoothly, her movements deliberate but unhurried, maintaining the appearance of routine compliance while her peripheral vision tracked the federal surveillance team's reactions to her approach. The woman with the portfolio shifted in her seat, not standing but adjusting her position to maintain visual contact as Natasha walked toward the service counter. The two men near the back wall remained seated, but their conversation ceased, their attention now focused entirely on monitoring her interaction with the DMV employee. The maintenance worker near the entrance moved slightly closer to the exit doors, positioning himself to intercept anyone attempting to leave quickly. Natasha reached window 5 and placed her manila folder on the counter, opening it with practiced efficiency to reveal documents arranged in the sequence typically requested for license renewal. The DMV employee, a middle-aged woman with graying hair and the patient demeanor of someone who had processed thousands of similar transactions, smiled with genuine warmth. "Good afternoon. License renewal today?" the employee asked, reaching for the documents while simultaneously accessing the computer system that would verify Natasha's information against state and federal databases. "Yes, ma'am," Natasha replied, her voice steady and polite. "Everything should be in order." The employee, whose name tag identified her as Margaret Torres, began examining the documents with the methodical attention that government workers applied to paperwork verification. Birth certificate first, checking the embossed seal and official signatures. Social Security card next, noting the card stock and printing quality that indicated authenticity. Current license, comparing the photograph to the person standing before her. "Address change?" Margaret asked, noting the discrepancy between the license address and the utility bill that served as proof of current residence. "Yes, I moved about 18 months ago," Natasha confirmed. "All the documentation for the new address should be there." Margaret nodded and continued her review, but Natasha noticed that the computer screen was displaying more information than typically required for routine license renewal. Multiple windows were open, suggesting database queries that went beyond standard DMV verification procedures. Federal involvement in the process was now confirmed. Behind her, the woman with the portfolio had risen from her seat and was approaching the service counter area, not close enough to interfere, but near enough to intervene if the situation required immediate action. Her movement was casual, designed to appear like someone growing impatient with her own wait time, but her positioning was tactically sound for rapid response to developing circumstances. "I need to verify some information," Margaret said, her tone remaining professional but with a slight tension that suggested she was following instructions rather than standard procedure. "Could you remove your jacket, please? We need to confirm identity for the enhanced security features on the new licenses. The request was unusual but not unprecedented. Enhanced security measures had been implemented in various states following federal mandates, and identity verification sometimes required additional steps beyond standard documentation review. But Natasha recognized the request for what it actually was: an attempt to expose her arms, where identifying scars would be visible to surveillance personnel. "Is that really necessary for a renewal?" Natasha asked, maintaining polite cooperation while buying time to assess her options. "I have all the required documentation." "I'm sorry, but it's part of the new federal requirements," Margaret replied, though her expression suggested she was as uncomfortable with the request as Natasha was with complying. "It will only take a moment." The federal surveillance team was now positioned for optimal observation. The woman with the portfolio had moved to within 10 feet of the service counter, close enough to see details that camera surveillance might miss. The two men near the back wall had shifted to angles that provided clear sight lines to the interaction area. The maintenance worker was ready to secure the exit if the situation required containment. Natasha looked directly at Margaret, making the kind of eye contact that established human connection beyond bureaucratic procedure. "Ma'am, I've served my country, and I have scars that I'd prefer not to display in public. Is there another way we can handle the verification?" The statement was carefully constructed to acknowledge her military background while establishing reasonable grounds for refusing the request. It also served notice to the federal surveillance team that she was aware of their interest and wasn't going to cooperate passively with their investigation. Margaret's expression softened with understanding, but she glanced nervously toward her supervisor's office, clearly caught between competing directives. "I appreciate your service, but I have specific instructions about this procedure. I really need you to comply with the request." The moment had arrived where cooperation and resistance would determine the outcome of the entire encounter. Natasha could remove her jacket, exposing the shrapnel scars that would confirm whatever suspicions had triggered federal interest in her presence. She could refuse, potentially escalating the situation into confrontation that would draw additional attention and complicate her ability to leave peacefully. Or she could find a third option that satisfied bureaucratic requirements while maintaining her privacy. "I understand you're following procedures," Natasha said, reaching for the zipper of her jacket. "But I want it noted that this request seems unusual for routine license renewal." She unzipped the jacket slowly, not from reluctance but to maintain control of the situation's pacing. The federal agents would get their confirmation, but on her terms rather than theirs. As the jacket came off, the long sleeves of her shirt remained in place, covering most of her arms while revealing only her hands and a small section of each forearm. The scars were immediately visible. Small, irregular marks on her left forearm, where shrapnel had penetrated skin and muscle during a mortar attack outside Kandahar. The wounds had healed cleanly, but the scars remained as permanent, evidence of combat exposure that no amount of time or distance could erase. Margaret's eyes widened slightly as she noticed the scars, but her reaction was human rather than procedural. Recognition of sacrifice rather than identification of a target. "Thank you for your service," she said quietly, then turned back to her computer terminal to complete the license processing. But the federal surveillance team's reaction was entirely different. The woman with the portfolio had moved close enough to photograph the scars with a small camera concealed in her hand, confirming identification that matched whatever intelligence files they had been consulting. The two men near the back wall were now standing, preparing to approach the service counter for contact that would no longer require pretense about routine surveillance. "Miss Chun," said a voice behind her, and Natasha turned to see a man in his 40s wearing a dark suit that marked him as federal law enforcement. His badge was visible in his jacket pocket, though he hadn't formally displayed it yet. "I'm Agent David Richardson with the Defense Criminal Investigative Service. We need to speak with you." The approach was professional but firm, designed to establish authority while avoiding the kind of confrontation that would disrupt DMV operations or create public disturbance. Other people in the waiting area were beginning to notice the interaction, their conversations quieting as they sensed tension that went beyond routine government business. About what? Natasha asked, completing the process of putting her jacket back on while maintaining eye contact with Agent Richardson. Her voice remained calm, but her posture had shifted subtly into a more defensive stance. "There are some questions about your military service that require clarification," Richardson replied. "We can discuss this here, or we can arrange a more private conversation at our field office." The choice was designed to pressure her into compliance by suggesting that cooperation would be easier than resistance. But Natasha understood that federal investigations rarely ended with simple clarification, and that voluntary cooperation often led to complications that were difficult to resolve without legal representation. "I'd prefer to handle this through my attorney," she said, reaching into her jacket pocket for her wallet while keeping her movements slow and visible. "I can provide you with contact information if you'd like to schedule a formal meeting." Agent Richardson's expression didn't change, but the woman with the portfolio moved closer, positioning herself to prevent easy access to the exit doors. The surveillance operation was transitioning into detention, though they hadn't yet announced that transition formally. "Ms. Chun, we have information suggesting that you may have knowledge relevant to an ongoing investigation," Richardson continued. "Your cooperation would be appreciated, but we can obtain the information we need through other means if necessary." The threat was subtle but clear: cooperate voluntarily or face more aggressive investigation techniques that could disrupt her civilian life in ways that would be difficult to repair. Federal agencies had resources that could make normal existence impossible for people who became targets of sustained scrutiny. Margaret Torres had been watching this interaction with growing alarm, clearly uncomfortable with the way routine DMV business had become a federal law enforcement operation. "Excuse me," she said to Agent Richardson, "but this lady is just trying to renew her license. Is this really the appropriate place for this kind of conversation?" Richardson turned toward Margaret with the kind of polite dismissal that federal agents used when civilians questioned their authority. "Ma'am, this is official government business. We appreciate your cooperation in allowing us to complete our work." But Margaret's intervention had created an opportunity. While Richardson was addressing the DMV employee, Natasha took a step toward the counter, placing herself in a position where she could address Margaret directly while maintaining distance from the federal agents. "Ma'am, could you please complete my license renewal?" she asked Margaret. "I believe you have all the documentation you need, and I've complied with your verification requirements." Margaret looked between Natasha and Agent Richardson, clearly uncertain about proper procedure when federal law enforcement became involved in state government business. But her training emphasized customer service and regulatory compliance, and Natasha's request was reasonable within DMV procedures. "The renewal is almost complete," Margaret said, turning back to her computer terminal. "I just need to process the payment and print the temporary license." Agent Richardson stepped forward, his patience clearly diminishing. "Ms. Chun, I need you to come with us now. This conversation needs to happen whether you prefer it or not." The federal team was abandoning subtle surveillance in favor of direct confrontation, but they were doing so in a public space where their authority was limited and their actions were being observed by civilians who might ask inconvenient questions. About appropriate procedures, Natasha reached into her wallet and extracted $47 in cash, placing it on the counter in front of Margaret. "For the renewal fee," she said, maintaining her focus on completing the bureaucratic transaction, while federal agents attempted to assert control over the situation. "Ma'am, please step away from the counter," said the woman with the portfolio, who had now moved close enough to attempt physical intervention. if Natasha refused to cooperate with their demands, but Margaret Torres had decided that DMV procedures took precedence over federal law enforcement convenience. She processed Natasha's payment, printed a temporary license, and handed it across the counter with the kind of professional courtesy that government employees provided to all citizens regardless of the complications surrounding their transactions. Your permanent license will be mailed to your address within 10 business days, Margaret said, completing the standard script that concluded every renewal transaction. Thank you for choosing to conduct your business with the California Department of Motor Vehicles. Natasha took the temporary license and placed it in her wallet, then looked directly at Agent Richardson. Thank you for your patience while I completed my business here. If you need to discuss anything related to my military service, please contact my attorney. I'll be happy to cooperate through appropriate legal channels. She turned toward the exit, moving with the calm confidence of someone who had completed legitimate business and was leaving through normal procedures. The federal surveillance team faced a choice: allow her to leave while maintaining the pretense that this had been routine observation, or escalate to detention that would require formal justification and legal procedures they might not be prepared to implement. Agent Richardson made the decision to let her walk, but his expression suggested that this encounter was the beginning rather than the end of federal interest in her activities. The surveillance would continue, the investigation would expand, and her carefully constructed civilian life was about to become much more complicated than routine license renewal. The automatic doors of the DMV building slid open with their familiar mechanical whisper, releasing Natasha into the late afternoon heat that had been building throughout the day. The sun hung low in the western sky, casting long shadows across the parking lot where heat waves shimmered off asphalt that had been absorbing solar energy since dawn. She walked toward her Honda Accord with measured steps, neither hurrying nor dawdling, maintaining the appearance of routine completion of bureaucratic business. Behind her, through the glass doors, she could see Agent Richardson speaking urgently into his cell phone while the woman with the portfolio gathered her equipment and prepared to leave the building. The federal surveillance team was regrouping, reassessing their approach now that direct confrontation had failed to produce the cooperation they had expected. Their operation would continue, but it would take different forms that she would need to anticipate and counter. Her car was parked in the third row, positioned to provide multiple exit routes from the lot while maintaining visibility of the building entrance. As she approached the vehicle, she conducted a subtle inspection for signs of tampering, tracking devices, surveillance equipment, or evidence that the car had been searched while she was inside. The dust patterns on the hood and roof appeared undisturbed, and the door handle showed no signs of recent manipulation. She unlocked the car and slid into the driver's seat, immediately starting the engine while scanning the parking lot for vehicles that might contain additional surveillance personnel. A white sedan near the DMV entrance had two occupants who appeared to be waiting rather than preparing to leave. A panel van in the far corner had darkened windows that could conceal observation equipment. The federal interest in her activities was more extensive than the team inside the building had suggested. Before leaving the parking lot, she opened the glove compartment and retrieved a burner phone that she had purchased 6 months earlier but never activated. The device was prepaid, untraceable to her identity, and equipped with basic communication capabilities that would allow her to make necessary contacts without using her regular phone, which was certainly being monitored by now. The drive from the DMV to her apartment complex normally took 12 minutes, but today she took a route that required 27 minutes and included several turns designed to identify vehicles that might be following her. The white sedan maintained distance, but matched her movements through 3 unnecessary turns before finally breaking off and heading in a different direction. Professional surveillance, but not invisible to someone who understood the techniques being used. Her apartment building looked exactly as it had when she left that morning. Faded stucco. Minimal landscaping, the kind of anonymity that came from housing designed for people who needed shelter rather than status. But as she pulled into her assigned parking space, she noticed that the maintenance truck she had seen parked near the building entrance for the past week was gone. Small changes in environment often indicated larger shifts in circumstance. Climb to her second-floor apartment was routine, 24 steps, 2 turns, past doors that revealed nothing about the people who lived behind them. Her neighbors were shift workers, single parents, retirees on fixed incomes, and other people who valued privacy and minded their own business. The kind of community where federal agents would stand out rather than blend in. Her door showed no signs of entry, but she knew that professional searches could be conducted without leaving obvious evidence. Inside, she conducted a systematic inspection of her belongings, looking for items that had been moved, drawers that weren't quite closed properly, or furniture that had been shifted slightly during examination. Everything appeared undisturbed. But appearance and reality were often different when federal agencies became interested in someone's activities. The first priority was communication. She activated the burner phone and called a number she had memorized but never used, a legal aid organization that specialized in representing veterans who had encountered difficulties with military or federal agencies. The conversation was brief and professional. She needed immediate legal representation for potential federal investigation. She could pay reasonable fees, and she required someone with security clearance who could review classified materials if necessary. The attorney who returned her call 20 minutes later was Jennifer Martinez, a former military lawyer who had transitioned to civilian practice, specializing in veterans' rights and federal employment issues. Her voice carried the competent authority of someone who understood both military culture and civilian legal systems. They arranged to meet the following morning at her office, where they could discuss the situation in detail and develop appropriate response strategies. The second priority was preparation for extended surveillance and potential relocation. Natasha began organizing her belongings with the efficiency that came from years of practice in rapid deployment scenarios. Essential documents went into a waterproof folder that could be carried easily. Clothing was sorted into immediate needs and items that could be left behind if circumstances required sudden departure. Her financial resources were already organized for quick access. Cash reserves distributed between her apartment and a safety deposit box, bank accounts that could be closed remotely, and investment funds that could be liquidated without lengthy procedures. She had learned long ago that mobility required financial independence, and that people who couldn't move quickly often became victims of circumstances beyond their control. The third priority was information management. Her laptop contained no sensitive data. She had maintained strict separation between her civilian identity and any information that could compromise her security if discovered by hostile agencies. But the federal investigation would certainly include analysis of her digital communications, financial transactions, and online activities. She began documenting these activities in preparation for legal review. As evening approached, she prepared a simple meal and reviewed her options for the immediate future. Staying in Bakersfield would mean accepting constant surveillance and periodic harassment as federal agents attempted to develop information about her past activities. Moving to another city would require abandoning the life she had built here, but it would provide temporary respite from official attention until they located her again. The third option was more complex, but potentially more effective. She could cooperate selectively with the federal investigation while maintaining legal protection, providing information that satisfied their immediate concerns without compromising operational security or revealing details that could endanger other people. This approach required careful legal guidance and strategic thinking about what information was genuinely sensitive versus what appeared Important but was actually harmless. Her phone rang at 8:47 p.m., the burner device she had activated earlier that day. Only one person had that number, which meant her attorney was calling with preliminary information about the federal investigation. That was now documented in official records. "Miss Chen, this is Jennifer Martinez. I've made some inquiries about your situation, and I need to tell you that the federal interest in your case is more serious than typical post-service review. They have specific allegations that will require careful response." The conversation that followed lasted 37 minutes and covered legal strategies, constitutional protections, and practical considerations for someone who had become a federal target. Martinez had reviewed Natasha's military records, identified the incident that had triggered current investigation, and developed preliminary recommendations for managing the situation without compromising her civilian life more than necessary. The allegations centered on her final deployment, specifically her decision to provide medical assistance to wounded civilians who had been designated as enemy combatants by field commanders. The families of those civilians had filed complaints with international human rights organizations, claiming that American military personnel had violated Geneva Convention protocols. The federal investigation was attempting to determine whether criminal charges should be filed against personnel who had participated in the incidents. But there was another dimension to the investigation that Martinez had discovered through her contacts in the veterans' legal community. Several soldiers who had served in Natasha's unit had been contacted by federal investigators over the past 6 months, and their interviews had focused on allegations that some unit members had provided intelligence to civilian populations about impending military operations. The investigation was looking for evidence of collaboration with enemy forces. The charges, if filed, would be serious enough to result in federal prosecution, imprisonment, and the destruction of her civilian life. But the evidence was circumstantial, based primarily on witness statements from people who had not been present during the incidents in question. The federal case was strong enough to justify investigation, but not strong enough to guarantee successful prosecution. Martinez's recommendation was strategic. Cooperation, provide information that demonstrated loyalty and proper conduct while refusing to discuss operational details that were legitimately classified. The approach would satisfy federal concerns about her reliability while protecting information that could compromise ongoing military operations or endanger personnel who were still serving in combat zones. The conversation ended with an agreement to meet at Martinez's office the following morning, where they would review relevant documents and develop a comprehensive response strategy. Natasha would remain in Bakersfield for the immediate future, continue working at Morrison Industrial Supply, and maintain normal routines while the legal process unfolded. Running would only confirm federal suspicions about her guilt. After the call ended, she sat in her small living room and considered the path that had led from combat zones in Afghanistan to federal investigation in California. Every decision had seemed reasonable at the time: protecting civilians, maintaining operational security, transitioning to civilian life, building a new identity around honest work and quiet existence. But those decisions had created a chain of consequences that was now threatening everything she had worked to achieve. The scars on her arms were evidence of service and sacrifice, but they had also become identifying markers that federal agents could use to confirm her identity and build their case. The skills that had kept her alive in combat zones were now being interpreted as evidence of potential disloyalty. The moral choices that had defined her character were being re-examined as possible violations of military law. Outside her apartment window, the parking lot was quiet except for the occasional car returning late from work or social activities. The neighborhood maintained its usual rhythm of people managing their own lives without excessive interest in their neighbor's business. But she knew that federal surveillance would soon extend to this location, bringing official attention to a community that had valued privacy and anonymity. Her phone displayed 17 Missed calls from a number she didn't recognize. Likely federal agents attempting to establish contact after their unsuccessful approach at the DMV. She deleted the notifications without listening to voicemails, maintaining her position that all official communication would be handled through legal representation rather than direct contact. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as the federal investigation expanded and her legal defense took shape. But tonight, she would maintain the routines that had sustained her through previous crises: physical training, equipment maintenance, mental preparation for uncertain outcomes. She had survived combat, military bureaucracy, and the transition to civilian life. She would survive this challenge as well. The evening news carried no mention of federal investigations or veterans' legal issues, focusing instead on local politics, traffic problems, and weather forecasts that promised continued heat throughout the week. Her situation remained private for now, known only to the federal agents conducting the investigation and the legal professionals who would help her navigate the challenges ahead. As she prepared for sleep, Natasha considered the irony that her military service, which had been motivated by desire to protect American civilians and democratic values, was now being investigated as potential betrayal of those same principles. The complexity of combat situations rarely translated clearly into legal proceedings, and decisions that made sense in life-threatening circumstances often appeared questionable when examined by people who had never faced similar pressures. But she had learned that survival required adaptability rather than resentment, strategic thinking rather than emotional reaction, and careful preparation rather than hope that problems would resolve themselves. The federal investigation was another mission that required successful completion, and she would approach it with the same professional competence that had characterized her military service and civilian career. The temporary license in her wallet was proof that bureaucratic systems could still function normally, even when federal agencies were conducting surveillance operations. Small victories mattered when larger battles were just beginning and maintaining normal life routines was often the most effective form of resistance against agencies that wanted to disrupt civilian existence. Tomorrow would bring legal consultations, strategic planning, and the beginning of a defense that would determine whether her carefully constructed civilian life could survive federal scrutiny. But tonight, she was still Natasha Chen, resident of Bakersfield, California, holder of a valid driver's license, citizen of a country that promised legal protections, even when federal agencies decided that former soldiers had become potential threats to national security. 3 months after the encounter at the DMV, the federal investigation had evolved into something neither Natasha nor her attorney had anticipated. What began as allegations of improper conduct during military service had transformed into a complex legal proceeding that revealed systemic problems with how combat decisions were being reviewed by agencies that had never operated in hostile environments. Jennifer Martinez had proven to be more than competent legal representation. She was a strategic thinker who understood both the legal system and the political dimensions of cases involving military veterans. Her approach had been to challenge not just the specific allegations against Natasha, but the entire framework that allowed federal agencies to prosecute former service members for decisions made under combat conditions. The breakthrough came when Martinez obtained classified documents through discovery proceedings that revealed the true scope of the federal investigation. Natasha's case was part of a larger effort to identify and prosecute military personnel who had deviated from strict operational protocols during deployments in Afghanistan and Iraq. The goal was to demonstrate civilian control over military operations by holding individual soldiers accountable for decisions that their commanders had tacitly approved. But the documents also revealed something that fundamentally changed the nature of the case. The civilians Natasha had helped were not enemy combatants, as field reports had indicated. They were refugees who had been misidentified by intelligence sources, and their presence in the combat zone had resulted from evacuation orders that had been issued but not properly communicated to frontline units. Her decision to provide medical assistance had likely prevented an international incident that could have damaged American relationships with allied nations. More significantly, the investigation had uncovered evidence that the allegations against her had been fabricated by a private contractor who was being investigated for fraud, and had attempted to deflect attention from his own misconduct by claiming that military personnel had interfered with his operations. The witness statements that formed the foundation of the federal case had been provided by individuals who were being paid by the contractor and had never actually observed the incidents they described. The revelation transformed Natasha from target to potential prosecution witness in a much larger case involving defense contractor fraud, falsified intelligence reports, and systematic attempts to blame military personnel for operational failures that had been caused by civilian mismanagement. Federal prosecutors who had been building a case against her were now requesting her cooperation in prosecuting the people who had targeted her. But the 3 months of investigation had taken their toll on her civilian life in ways that legal vindication couldn't completely repair. Morrison Industrial Supply had been forced to conduct their own background investigation when federal agents began interviewing her coworkers and reviewing company records. While Gary Henderson had been supportive throughout the process, the disruption to normal business operations had created complications that affected her job security. Her apartment complex had also been subjected to federal scrutiny, with agents questioning neighbors and examining security records in ways that violated the community's expectation of privacy. Several residents had complained to management about the government intrusion, and while Natasha had done nothing wrong, her presence had become associated with problems that other people preferred to avoid. The decision to relocate came not from legal necessity, but from practical recognition that her life in Bakersfield had been permanently altered by the investigation. Even after the charges were dropped and her conduct was officially vindicated, the federal attention had created a level of visibility that was incompatible with the anonymity she required for peace of mind. Martinez had helped her negotiate a settlement with the federal government that included compensation for legal expenses, lost wages, and the disruption to her civilian life caused by the unfounded investigation. The amount was sufficient to support relocation and provide financial security while she established herself in a new location, but it came with a non-disclosure agreement that prevented her from discussing the details of the case publicly. New location was Portland, Oregon, chosen for its veteran-friendly community, employment opportunities in logistics and supply chain management, and whether that would be a welcome change from California's perpetual heat. She had found work with a shipping company that specialized in international freight, applying her organizational skills to the complex requirements of global commerce. The apartment she selected was similar to her previous housing, modest, functional, positioned for security and privacy. But this time, she had been more careful about documentation trails, using legal methods to minimize her digital footprint while maintaining the ability to prove her identity when necessary. The federal investigation had taught her that even legitimate privacy measures could be interpreted as suspicious by agencies that were looking for reasons to justify their interest. Her new employer, Pacific Northwest Logistics, had been informed about her military background and the recent federal investigation in general terms that satisfied their security requirements without revealing classified details. The company's owner was a Marine veteran who understood that good soldiers sometimes faced official scrutiny for doing the right thing under difficult circumstances. Her hiring had been based on competence rather than background investigation. The work was similar to her previous job, but with additional responsibilities that reflected her proven ability to manage complex situations under pressure. She coordinated shipments between Asian manufacturers and American distributors, managed customs documentation for international cargo, and supervised warehouse operations that required both efficiency and attention to regulatory compliance. The job utilized her skills while providing the kind of professional satisfaction that had been missing from her previous employment. Her colleagues were a mix of veterans and civilians who had found their way into logistics, worked through various paths. Former military personnel who understood the importance of precise procedures, career civilians who appreciated working with people who took responsibility seriously, and younger employees who were learning that attention to detail could make the difference between successful operations and expensive mistakes. The scars on her arms were no longer sources of potential identification by hostile agencies. They had become conversation starters with other veterans who recognized the marks of combat service and understood that some experiences couldn't be adequately explained to people who hadn't shared similar circumstances. The community of veterans in Portland included people who had served in various conflicts and understood that military service created bonds that transcended differences in background or political perspective. 6 months after relocating to Portland, Natasha received a letter from the Department of Defense informing her that her military records had been reviewed and amended to reflect the accurate circumstances of her final deployment. The disciplinary notations that had resulted from her decision to provide medical assistance to misidentified civilians had been removed, and her service record now accurately reflected the heroic nature of her actions under combat conditions. Letter was accompanied by a formal apology from the Defense Criminal Investigative Service for the unfounded investigation that had disrupted her civilian life, and a commendation from her former commanding officer who had learned the truth about the circumstances surrounding her final mission. The recognition meant more to her than the financial settlement had, because it represented official acknowledgement that her moral choices had been correct even when they appeared to violate military protocols. But perhaps more meaningful was a second letter that arrived the same day, this one from Rebecca Morrison, her former lieutenant who had become a major and was now serving in a training capacity at Fort Bragg. Morrison had learned about the investigation and its resolution through military channels, and she wanted Natasha to know that their shared experiences in Afghanistan had been reviewed and recognized as exemplary combat leadership under impossible conditions. The letter revealed that Morrison had been interviewed by federal investigators and had provided testimony that strongly supported Natasha's version of events. She had also been contacted by other members of their former unit, all of whom had expressed similar support and all of whom had been cleared of any wrongdoing related to their service in Afghanistan. The investigation that had targeted Natasha had been part of a broader effort that had failed to find evidence of misconduct among military personnel. Morrison's letter included current contact information and an invitation to visit Fort Bragg if Natasha was ever in North Carolina. The gesture represented something that military service had promised, but civilian life had rarely delivered: permanent connections with people who understood the complexity of moral decision-making under combat conditions and who valued character over compliance with bureaucratic procedures. The 1-year anniversary of the DMV encounter passed without official recognition, but Natasha marked it privately by visiting the Portland Veterans Hospital, where she volunteered occasionally with other former service members who were transitioning to civilian life. Her experience with federal investigation and legal defense had taught her valuable lessons about navigating systems that could be hostile to veterans who didn't fit standard categories. She had begun speaking informally with veterans who were facing their own legal or bureaucratic challenges, sharing practical knowledge about documentation, legal representation, and the importance of maintaining financial independence while official proceedings were ongoing. Her advice was based on hard-won experience rather than theoretical knowledge, and it was delivered with the credibility that came from someone who had successfully defended against serious allegations. The work was unpaid and unofficial, but it provided the kind of meaningful service that had motivated her original decision to join the military. Helping other veterans navigate complex systems felt like a natural extension of her military mission to protect American citizens and democratic values, even when those systems sometimes worked against the people who had sworn to defend them. Her apartment in Portland had gradually acquired personal touches that had been absent from her previous housing. Photographs from hiking trips in the Pacific Northwest, books about regional history and environmental conservation, kitchen equipment that reflected an interest in cooking rather than just consuming nutrition. The changes were subtle but significant, representing a level of comfort with permanent residence that she hadn't felt since leaving military service. The leather jacket remained part of her wardrobe, but it was no longer the primary barrier between her identity and public scrutiny. The scars on her arms had become integrated into her personal history, rather than hidden evidence of experiences she couldn't discuss. The federal investigation had paradoxically given her more freedom to be authentic about her military background. Because official vindication had removed the fear that discussing her service would trigger unwanted attention. On quiet evenings, she sometimes reviewed the temporary driver's license that had been issued during that memorable DMV visit, now expired and replaced by Oregon documentation that reflected her current address and circumstances. The small plastic card represented a moment when her carefully constructed civilian life had been threatened by forces beyond her control, but also when she had demonstrated that military training and civilian rights could be combined effectively. To resist unjust official pressure, the federal agents who had confronted her that day had been doing their jobs according to procedures and priorities that made sense within their institutional framework. But they had underestimated the resources and determination of someone who understood both military discipline and civilian law, and who was willing to fight for principles that transcended personal convenience or institutional compliance. Margaret Torres, the DMV employee who had completed Natasha's license renewal despite federal pressure, had been recognized by her supervisors for maintaining professional standards under difficult circumstances. Martinez had ensured that Torres received official commendation for her adherence to proper procedures, demonstrating that civilian employees could resist inappropriate federal pressure while maintaining their professional responsibilities. Story of the DMV encounter had become part of veterans' community folklore in Portland, shared quietly among people who understood that military service sometimes created ongoing obligations and vulnerabilities that civilian institutions weren't designed to handle. Natasha's successful defense against federal allegations had become an example of how veterans could protect themselves and each other through proper legal representation and community support. As the second anniversary of the DMV incident approached, Natasha had achieved something that had seemed impossible during those months of federal investigation: a civilian life that incorporated, rather than concealed, her military experience. Her work utilized skills developed during military service. Her community connections included other veterans who shared common experiences, and her personal identity no longer required the constant vigilance that had characterized her previous attempts at anonymity. The scars on her arms had become symbols of service rather than sources of vulnerability, visible reminders of sacrifices made in defense of values that remained worth protecting. The federal investigation had tested, but ultimately confirmed her loyalty to those values, and the legal victory had demonstrated that individual citizens could successfully resist government overreach when they understood their rights and had access to competent representation. The lesson was both personal and political. Military service created obligations that extended beyond active duty, but it also provided resources for defending democratic principles against institutional abuse. Veterans who understood both military culture and civilian law could serve as bridges between institutions that sometimes worked at cross purposes, helping ensure that government power was exercised in ways that honored the sacrifices of those who had served in uniform. In the end, the DMV encounter had been transformed from a moment of crisis into an opportunity for growth. From a threat to her civilian identity into confirmation of her capacity to defend herself and others against unjust official pressure. The federal agents who had tried to force her jacket off in front of everyone had inadvertently revealed not weakness but strength, not guilt but innocence, not vulnerability but the kind of resilience that military service had been designed to develop and civilian life had been intended to reward. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe. And turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.